If you're a portrait photographer, chances are you have a problem with necklines, in the sense that everybody has them, but we don't know how to deal with them in the most efficient way possible. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you a couple of techniques and methods in taking care of them, no matter your lighting condition and your subject. Necklines are always something that happens if you turn or if your subject just has more prominent areas of the neck that need to be evened out. And usually you don't really want to go too far on this, which is why I'm doing a video specifically on necklines. And obviously you're going to have worst case scenarios than this, but I think this is a good example of how to use a couple of tools in order to minimize that. Well, this again was shot by Sue, and I really like this portrait because it exemplifies a lot of what happens when a subject is turned to one side a little bit. You get a crease on the neck. Usually you want to keep a lot of that, but it's very similar to the under eyes in that you want to keep a lot of that character, but you want to minimize it, which is why the tools we use for the under eyes also are used for necklines. So if you've seen that video, this is more of a follow through on how to use that tool for other areas. And as you notice, it's such a powerful tool to accomplish so many different things. First, I want to mention that there's a couple of ways to do this, and I'm going to show you a couple of ways because depending on the circumstance, it'll change the way that you use that specific tool. Firstly, we'll start again by adding a blank layer. As you can see, I'm clearly a fan of blank layers. I use that all the time for everything, and I think it's fantastic because it's versatile. You can change the opacity, you can add a mask, and it just gives me a safety net in case I go too far. So I'll name this, again, my clone brush layer, and I'll compare and contrast this with using a healing brush, because I think a lot of people try to use healing brush on some of these areas and they don't really work. Now the goal here is that I don't want to remove the line completely, but what I want to do is minimize it. And accordingly, because of that, the clone brush is the best tool for the job, at least in my opinion. If I use the clone brush, I want to be sure that my flow is set to about 5%, and that I have my sample size set to current and below, first and foremost, and that my brush is at 0% hardness. Because you don't want to use a hard brush on skin, it just creates edges. If I try to do that, you'll notice that you can see that there's an edge that happens every time I brush. And we don't want that edge from happening. So naturally, we'll keep our hardness set to 0%. Now we'll come back here. And the key to this, and what makes this tutorial different than the under eyes, is where to sample. Because sampling and brush sizes and the flow is where the magic really happens in dealing with these situations in a quick manner. What I'm going to do first is test and see if where I'm sampling works. Because my flow is low, it's going to give me a quick representation of what I'm doing. So if I don't do something correctly, I'll be able to see right away. I'm going to sample right here at the top of the neckline and start dealing with some of these areas at the bottom. Another thing that I'm thinking of is that I don't want to use one sample point for the entire neckline. I'm going to sample continuously through the process. So as I deal with the bottom and finish that area, then I'm going to go to the top and sample something else as I'm brushing there as well. Because I feel like it might be a little bit easier to manage, especially when you first go around. I'll sample the Option key and click on the skin. And what that does, it's going to sample everything that Photoshop is looking at. And then as I come here, I'll start brushing. And you'll notice that because of its 5%, it's coming in really slowly. And that's exactly what I want. I don't want it to go away really quickly. I want it to be really gentle and slow. So that as I continue going forward and there's anything else that I want to lighten, I can change the intensity of it. And just like that, based on how light my flow was, I was able to feather off how much lighter this part was versus how dark I kept this part. So I did a minimal amount of lighting up top, but I added a few strokes at the bottom where it mostly needed it. Another aspect is, as you know, if you overclone something, you might see a line pop up like this. And that line is because once I sampled really close to this neckline, it basically started carrying this neckline over this side. It's really easy to fix. All I need to do is just use my eraser brush. Again, we'll drag this flow to about 3% and just gently erase that bit out. So that's how I'm going to take care of that. And as you notice, it looks pretty good. There's a couple of other things that I want to talk about as well. And number one is the natural necklines that appear on the neck. This happens regardless of whether or not you're turned or you're looking straight forward. It's just one of those things. Typically, these things are something that I would ask my client, or Sue, for instance. She would tell me exactly what she wants me to do, and I'll adhere accordingly. So maybe this is not an example that you want to do for every single subject because it won't look right. Keep it up to discussion as well as how it looks visually. Now these necklines over here, an easy way to tackle that is also utilizing the same thing by either just cloning like this, and using that 5% I think really, really helps. And that will minimize that. Another really great tool is if I don't want to do that. Let me just hit Command Z or Command Option Z a couple of times to undo. If I want to minimize those necklines more naturally and keep all the texture, I can actually add another dodge and burn adjustment layer. So I'll click on Dodge, and I'll use my brush tool, making sure that the mask is selected, and my flow again is at 1 to 2%. And I will simply start brushing on the neckline. But before I do, I think I'm going to rotate my canvas just a little bit, because that angle that I'm seeing will be a lot easier to work on if it's a little bit more vertical, at least in my personal preference. So I'll use the rotate function tool here and rotate it. And in the keyboard section shortcut section, I talk about exactly how to change your shortcuts for these tools in order to make fast use of accessing them. For me, it's set to E, but by default, it's set to R. So now that I've rotated it to an angle that's easier to work on, I'll go back to my brush tool by hitting C, which is my shortcut, or B by default, and then simply brushing in some of these lines here. And what happens is that it diminishes not only the impact of the line itself, but also it keeps the texture there. And the beauty of that is people won't even know that you've done it because the texture is still there and it's really beautiful. So you don't really alter it as much as possible. I think that's the imperative goal for everything, is that you don't want to change texture if it's not necessary. And even using these necklines here as an example shows you how powerful this technique is. Because dodging also works for some of these thin lines, as long as you have a low flow and you make sure your brush size is exactly the size of the line. So the good thing is you can utilize both the clone method and dodging and burning in order to minimize some of these lines. I prefer dodging and burning a lot just because I'm not really moving around texture or softening up anything. I'm keeping the texture that's there, but it's fading it so that you can be sure that you don't overdo it and still keep all that beautiful texture. So as we zoom out here, you'll notice that if I turn my dodge layer on and off, it minimizes that line. It also minimizes these two lines here. And even cooler, it minimizes those fine lines that were on the neck coming into the shoulder blade. Alternatively, if you're trying to darken some of these white lines, which happen as well, I can use a burn layer, rotate this really quickly, and I will simply click and brush with a white brush on that mask, as I'm doing, and just lighten it up. If you end up going too far, let's say you end up overburning and you realize you made a mistake. This is actually typical. I mean, a lot of people have this happen when they first start dodging burning. All you need to do is make sure your brush is set to black and then go over it a few times. So what happens is that black brush will just back away. It's like an undo tool for the mask. It just backs away from how far you've been burning and dodging. So let me zoom out here really quickly and show you where we're at here. And I think zooming out is imperative because it keeps a perspective on exactly how far you've gone. I'll do the same thing here with my dodge. I will use the white brush and maybe continue a little bit further on some of these areas. And just like that, if I turn these 3 layers on and off, you'll see how far we've taken it. And the best part is because they're all in layers, you're able to go back at any time. Well, hopefully you found this tutorial helpful in order to minimize necklines by using some of the most common functions, which is the clone brush, the regular brush tool, and dodging burning to get you there.